Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on our journey and exploration through the recent Criterion Collection set that was released in 2020, this year, which is called Essential Fellini. And today, if you don't mind, I would like to focus our attention on the 12th Blu-ray disc, which is part of this set. And such disc 12 sets forth the film from 1973, and it is AMARCORD. From 1973. This is directed by Federico Fellini, and the story and screenplay are credited to Fellini and Tonino Guerra, and the music is by Nino Rota, and cinematography by Giuseppe Rotuno. This is, of course, the grand film, which is AMARCORD. If we were to try to describe what the film is about, I think we can describe it as being an episodic, structured film that is focusing in on the small provincial town in Italy during the 1930s. And that gives way to a focus on specific characters that inhabit this town, in particular a group of young boys, young youths, young adolescents, including the character of Tita. And we also see the various misadventures of these youths, whether it be in the context of certain people in the community, or whether it be in the context of school, or whether it be in the context of their families. We see various adventures and misadventures that these lads, these adolescents, undergo and go through. And that provides, I think, a great arena for some humorous mishap, some adolescent humor, some potty jokes, some sexual innuendo humor, which is all part of the landscape of boys growing up in this small town. And part of that discussion, too, is the way that youths grow up and experience the world. And through these experiences, they turn into adults. And what are those experiences? Well, we see how the film touches upon aspects of sexual innuendo humor, but that's not the only way that the film deals with issues of sexuality. We see, for example, how these boys are exploring their own sexualities and their own desires and yearnings and needs, and that's due to them growing up. And so this leads to various episodes with various women that are part of this community. And so we have some of the classic female characters that emerge in this film, such as the tobacconist character, such as Volpina, and of course one of the most iconic characters in all of Fellini's cinema, that of Gradisca. And she is one of the most memorable characters to be in this community, and also to inhabit any community in any Fellini film. And so we see how the community views her, we see how she views herself, and we also see examinations of her own sense of identity and self-worth, and how it plays in the context of her own life and her own feelings and her own desires for what it is she wants as a woman and as a human being. And so that's, I think, another fascinating aspect of this film. It really is able to, on the one hand, be this subjective viewpoint, which I think arguably can be said to be maybe a quasi-autobiographical or semi-autobiographical or qualified autobiographical point of view, which is understood to be from that of Fellini's perspective, although we always have to remember that this is a story that we understand came from Fellini and also from Guerra. So, but if we think of the filmmaker, we think that maybe this is something of his own life. And we understand also that Fellini's cinema oftentimes deals with cinematic situations from a very highly subjective and individualized sense of style and imagination. And so if we think of it in those terms, maybe we can see on the one hand the way that the film is looking at the world from a certain subjective viewpoint. But even with a film that might seem to have that construction, there is still room for the characters that are a part or subject to that perspective to still have a life of their own. And I think Gradiska is the perfect example of that, because she is at once the object of many of the affections of the people in this community, but also she is her own living, breathing character with her own arc and her own ambitions, which we see fulfilled as the film progresses from episode to episode to episode to its conclusion, which I find utterly fascinating. It means, in other words, this becomes a subjective viewpoint, but also becomes, in a way, that another expression of that thing in Fellini's cinema, which is the use of subjectivity and the use of artifice to try to get at a sense of truth. And maybe here in this example, this is the idea of the use of that kind of art of artifice in order to get at the truth of the humanity of a particular character, here being the character of Gradiska. And so I find this to be a very complex and bold and a quite dynamic and a very poetic expression of Fellini's cinema that is very much in keeping with the Fellini tradition. And it's also doing it in a way that is seemingly recalling the past and remembering the past. And if we know anything about Fellini's cinema, we also know that he is also concerned about the past, and for him it could be things that remind him of his own youth and his own childhood. Now, once again, I think we should keep in mind that this film, I'm not sure if we should take it to be a direct 100% autobiographical tale of Fellini's life and his life in Rimini, but perhaps that means that there might be a few or a lot of embellishments that are of an artistic nature that tend towards the fictional rather than the non-fictional. But still, there is this undeniable sense or spirit of some kind of expression, albeit through cinematic terms, some kind of expression of what it is that Fellini feels or remembers or senses or intuits about something to do with the past, and that past being something about his own past and his own life as a youth in Rimini. And so I think we see a lot of parallels. There are also a lot of subjective poetic expressions of cinema, but still there is that undeniable broad sense of something of the autobiographical spirit when we think about this film and those episodes. And so I think, and this I think rings true especially when we think about how the subject matter is recalled by other people. And we get a hint of this in some of the supplements that are included, and I'll get to that in the second part of this video. But now returning to the film, I think this way that Fellini is trying to examine or explore the past is, as I say, something that we have seen in his other works. For instance, we have seen the way that he examines history in films like Fellini Satyricon, or even a film like Roma, where he is dealing with some kind of deep-rooted sense of antiquity and a historical past and a heritage. And even here we have this sense of antiquity or heritage that is deeply personal and that is rooted in a time and place that once was but now no longer is. And so there is a sense of the nostalgic in the air. There's a sense of the bittersweet in the air that is captured so lovingly and so beautifully by the way that the light and the sunshine hits the walls, or the way that the people walk through the streets, or the way that the shadows hit the faces, or the way that the sounds linger in the air. There's something quite magical in that feeling of nostalgia that is conjured up here. But it is also a type of historical discussion or an examination that is not shying away from maybe the political and historical realities of the time, namely the 30s and the grip or the fascism, the nature of the fascist rule of government, and that had its effects even to the degree that it affected the way it did a small town like that which is depicted here in AMARCORD. And so Fellini is dealing with these themes as well. Now, does that mean that this film is a directly, specifically political film? I'm not making that suggestion, but what I am suggesting is that part of this historical discussion by Fellini has to do, or has to address, this idea of fascist Italy at the time. And what he does is something very extraordinary, in my view, which is he's taking it and he's looking at it through the perspective of a kind of subjectively based reality. And perhaps another way to describe a subjectively based reality is the viewpoint of children. And one of the ways that I think Fellini expresses this so well is focusing in on iconography and images and the visual cues of a particular thing or place or idea. I mean, we've seen this focus on the visual in things like Fellini's Satyricon or Roma. And I think that kind of treatment of the visual cue as part of historical discussion is also on display here. And it leads to some really fascinating avenues of discussion, because not only does it lead to certain aspects of the film that deal with the dark side of this kind of political discourse, but also it leads to some potentially funny moments, because after all, these images, when looked at through the lens of Fellini, can look very absurd and very grotesque indeed, almost to the point where one cannot help but laugh. And I think that feeling of laughter in the air is something akin to something, say, a kid might feel, something in a situation where he or she is not meant to laugh, but they want to laugh anyway. And I get that sense even in the scenes that have this thematic discussion in the context of Italian fascism in the 1930s. So the film does a number of different things with the same theme, something lighthearted and humored, or something that is more dark side and dark natured. And so I find, therefore, that type of varied ability to enter into a discourse based on historical discussion through the cinematic lens of Fellini to be another indication of how complex and how rich this film indeed is. And in those terms, I think it is very much a film consistent in the catalog of Fellini, but what's consistent in the way that it is another film like, say, I Vitelloni, where we have the focus on a group of characters in the small town situation, which I think could be interpreted to be this side of Fellini's own life, Rimini. But it is also consistent in the way that while it might seem to be a reminiscence, it is also a subjectively based one, and it is one that is created on the foundation of a cinematic art of artifice that is wholly in the realm of the Fellini-esque. And so we have these set pieces that are very much made in the studio, Cinecittà, and we have very famous set pieces like the Rex and other shots inside, indoors, that are very much constructions and artifice. But that is not in any way a negative thing, because as we have seen in many a Fellini film before, one of the things that he is so intent on in his art, I would suggest, would be to employ artifice in order to get at a sense of the truth and the truth of the human condition. And another way to put that is he uses his camera in order to try to capture the essence of the humanity of every single human being that walks his frame. And speaking of those human beings, this is also a very much a type of carnival-like celebration of the many different faces and figures and personalities that can inhabit the world of Fellini. And for instance, we have so many women that are in this world, and this is, I think, in the Fellini-esque manner, a kind of expression or depiction, if you will, of this kind of feminine character or femininity. And it is a type of femininity that is viewed from the masculine point of view. Undeniably something that Fellini has expressed in other films where he is focusing in on sort of the male fascination with women. And so we see that expressed here, but again, it is expressed in the context of youth growing up. And also we do see moments and opportunities where, as I indicated earlier, one of the iconic characters in any Fellini film, Gradiska, seems to gain a whole life of her own, which in turn I think is a great way that this seemingly view of women, as exemplified in many a Fellini film, including this, seems to get this incredible turn, if you will. That is, when we think about it too, not wholly inconsistent with the way that we've seen some other characters in the past treated, from characters in 8½, like Luisa and Carla, to characters like Cabiria, and also characters like Giulietta and Giulietta of the Spirits, etc. So there is this sense of consistency as well, even in this discussion of Fellini's works as it exists here in AMARCORD and in the rest of his body of work as well. But for these and other reasons, I think that this film is, of course, very consistent in the world of Fellini's filmography, and it is also capturing this semi-autobiographical spirit that may or may not be what Fellini really lived, but whatever the case may be, this is still a work of art from Federico Fellini. That is AMARCORD. The Blu-ray, which we have included in this set, the Essential Fellini set, is purported to be based on a 4K restoration of the film. We have to remember that this film has been released on a number of occasions by Criterion in the past, including this Blu-ray at spine number 4, which was in first printing around 2010. And there had been releases of the film prior to this, of course, but then we got ultimately this individual release of AMARCORD. And this was based on a high-definition transfer, which was further exemplified by what was part of the supplements of this package, which was a restoration demonstration. And it looked like, to me, it was a great version of the film, visually and in terms of sound as well. But we are getting the 4K restoration here of, or purported to be based on the 4K restoration of AMARCORD. And so it's a very interesting, fascinating presentation of the film. So I think you can still get a great presentation from the past releases, but you're also going to get a great presentation here, in my view, with this transfer. And as far as the supplements are concerned, we do get a number of, most of the supplements that we saw in the earlier individual release carried over into this Blu-ray disc, with a couple of exceptions. So one of those exceptions, let me start right now, is on the new Blu-ray we get this 1974 documentary type of film. Let me explain in a moment. It's called The Secret Diary of AMARCORD. And this is by Liliana Betti and Maurizio Main. And this is from 1974, approximately 44 minutes. And this is purported to be a behind-the-scenes documentary look at the making of AMARCORD from the viewpoint of people who were involved in the production. And so that's the basis of this documentary. But I mentioned the phrase quasi or faux documentary or mockumentary because it has that feel. There is a sense that maybe what we're watching might or might not be truly real. It could be staged, it could be artificial, or it could indeed be real, who knows. But therein lies the potential for a lot of humorous moments. There are these situations involving the stress of a production, a film production, that is very funny. There's a way that an interviewer is interviewing the way that an interviewer is interviewing Fellini and Guerra together, and there's a little bit of an argument about whether or not Guerra can understand German, which is very funny. There's also an exchange with an interviewer and Nino Rota, the composer, and there's a very funny exchange about a cigarette. And please watch it to get this, because it's very, very funny. And so it's one of these things also that seems to be blurring the line between what is real and what is not real. According to the credits, this is not a Fellini-directed film, but it's related to a Fellini work. And we do get other instances. For instance, there are like a roundtable discussion with some of the actors and participants of the film, AMARCORD, which is itself very fascinating, that gives rise to their descriptions of working with Fellini. There are also some moments where we get some scenes that weren't in the film, AMARCORD, the final version that we know of AMARCORD. So that in and of itself is also very fascinating. So we're getting a little glimpse as to what could have been, but ended up what the film could have been, but what ended up on the proverbial cutting room floor, as it were. Part of that discussion also related to that is an interview with Sandra Milo. And Sandra Milo is someone who is, of course, very well known in the world of Fellini cinema. She appeared very memorably in the films 8½, and also Juliet of the Spirits. And it's been described in past supplements, including the interview with Sandra Milo that is found on the disc of the film 8½, and other places, that she could have played the role of Gradiska in this film, a role that ended up being played by Magali Noel. But there was talk between Sandra Milo and Fellini, and plans to have her, in fact, play the role of Gradiska. That eventually, of course, did not happen due to certain reasons, and you can get a hint of that, for instance, in the Sandra Milo interview that is found on disc 8. But we have here Sandra Milo being interviewed by the interviewers here in this documentary, and she speaks, I think, also very honestly about how she felt about Magali Noel's performance. And also there are some moments where we actually see what I understand to be Sandra Milo dressed up as the character of Gradiska, and it's so surprising to see this. It really is, because we really get a sense of this character and what could have been had Sandra Milo played the role. And it's a fascinating what if. Of course, we still get ultimately the great performance by Magali Noel, who herself has appeared in a number of other Fellini works in the past, La Dolce Vita and also Fellini Satyricon. So she is also part of the world of the Fellini cinema, and her performance is magnificent. And it's, as I say, one of the most iconic characters in all of Fellini's cinema, as portrayed by Noel. But to see this Sandra Milo part of this documentary is so fascinating, and it really makes one compare, say, the Sandro Milo characters that we saw in 8½, and Juliet of the Spirits. And had she played this character of Gradiska, I think it would have made a nice trilogy, if you will, of Sandro Milo performances in Fellini's films, that are very distinct from each other, but also can be said to have this type of character arc that is very much in keeping with the discussion of expressions of femininity in Fellini's films that I was trying to suggest earlier in this video. So, as well as other aspects. So, but that is one part of this that's so fascinating. There is also an interesting scene that is showcased at the very start of this. And the Criterion Collection did a very interesting thing here, because the subject of the scene is arguably one of a racist character in the film that is focusing his racism towards an Asian character in this particular scene. Again, it didn't end up in the film itself, but the Criterion Collection, the people at the Criterion Collection decided it was appropriate to have a little disclaimer at the very start, at the very start of the supplement, to describe this particular scene, because it could be quite offensive without a sense of context. And so I think the Criterion Collection thought it best to try to provide that context before the scene is played in the beginning part of the documentary. So I find that to be very helpful, in fact. And so it's helpful to see this scene in context and see what it was, and perhaps maybe we can surmise as to the reasons why it ended up not being in the film at all. So. But anyway, this is The Secret Diary of AMARCORD, approximately 44 minutes. And it was not included in the individual release that I have here. But what was included on here, and what is now included on the Blu-ray, is another documentary called Fellini's Homecoming. And this is approximately 44 minutes. And this has a number of people commenting, relating, providing stories and anecdotes and their own views about Fellini and Fellini's relationship with the community and town of Rimini. And this is very important too, because it's directly relevant to the making of AMARCORD. And so the people that are participating in this documentary give some fascinating detail about the complex relationship between Fellini and his hometown of Rimini. It's very complex, and it's of a very almost nuanced psychological nature that exists prior to the making of AMARCORD, during the making of AMARCORD, and then after AMARCORD, all the way up to Federico Fellini's passing. So this is a really interesting story, and again, it's relevant to the making of AMARCORD. We do get, for example, the participants, Luigi Tita Benzi, who is the inspiration for the character of the main character of the film. And we also get comments from Vittorio Borarini and Tullio Kejic and Giuseppe Roturno, and we also get Sergio Zavoli, and we get their comments about the antecedents, or the connections, or the possible connections between the characters that we see in the film AMARCORD and the real-life people in the Rimini community, and who they might have been in Fellini's real life. And we also get discussions of the nature of the effects of fascism and how that played itself out both in real life versus how it was depicted in the film. And we have Luigi Tita Benzi explaining specifically how that is relevant in the context of his father, who is also being depicted in the film. And so we get an interesting way that the film depicts the father story versus how, according to the real life Benzi, how his father actually handled the situation involving fascism in this small town community. And we also see characters who they describe who the real life Gradiska could have been or was. They also describe other characters, the character of Aldina, who she was, Volpina, who she was. And they also describe the possibility that this film is, of course, it's a Fellini film, but it's also something of a story that is credited to Fellini and Guerra, and so there's also this sense of Guerra as well in what is being told, and we also get a sense of the rivalry, the friendly rivalry that existed between the two men. Also, we get a hint of what happened between Federico Fellini and Pier Paolo Pasolini as well. So there was apparent falling out between the two men and artists. So that's also referred to a little bit. It's referred to a little bit elsewhere as well, but it's referred to here. And we also get stories about how this film was made. It was made based in Cinecittà. It wasn't made in Rimini, so that is also a very interesting facet of the relationship between Fellini and Rimini, etc. And this all is, again, providing great room also for a discussion of the film AMARCORD, which, as I think the documentary is suggesting, is so much linked either directly or indirectly with Fellini's relationship with Rimini itself, and also with the people that inhabited the place. So this is a great one, and I'm so glad that it's carried over from the earlier releases. Also, something that's carried over is a 2006 interview with the actor Magali Noel. And this is approximately 15 minutes. It is in French, and she, of course, plays, she gives the magnificent performance as the one, the only, the iconic Gradiska. And so we get her reminiscing of how she got the part. Fellini called her up one night, 2 a.m, and invited her to essentially take on the role of Gradiska. And she did, and it was again a performance for the ages, I think. So memorable and just so warm and charming and so human. And I just love hearing Magali Noel's comments about this. And she is also explaining her relationship with Fellini and her working relationship with Fellini on this film and others. So it's such a lovely time with the great Magali Noel. Again, 15 minutes. And then there is another supplement, which we saw earlier, which is Fellini's drawings. And this is a kind of slideshow type of presentation of the sketches that we understand Fellini did of certain characters and situations of the film. And this is really interesting to see too, because we know that Fellini has his roots as a cartoonist. And so we see his own cartoonist artistic skills and gifts on display in this. And this is so cool. So it's great to have that here again. And then we also have another section of Felliniana, which is first a slideshow presentation of stills and poster art and press materials, etc., related to AMARCORD. Again, this is great stuff to see. And then there's a subsection here which is described as being radio ads. It's about 2 minutes in total. So this is the radio ads section, advertising AMARCORD. And then we have a deleted scene, approximately 3 minutes, which is described as being the scene involving the Contessa and the diamond ring. And there's no sound to it, but we can see a sense of what the scene was, and the way that it was framed, and the way that night and shadow and fog were used, or not fog, but night and shadow were used, and how characters in one level and characters in another level are being depicted. So this is the deleted scene. And then we have a trailer. I also should mention here that in the Blu-ray release and also in the new Blu-ray for the box set, we get the audio commentary track from film scholars Peter Brunette and Frank Burke. And it's great to have this audio commentary track here for the release of AMARCORD for the set, because it's a great one. It's another one that's packed full of information, well presented, and these people, these are experts in the world of Fellini, and they are admirers of the film. And so it's wonderful to have this maintained as part of the presentation for this box set. Also, speaking of audio options, we get the optional English dub track of the film that we can also experience as an option for the new Blu-ray. So that's also something that's interesting, just in case you might be curious about that version. But again, we don't get, well, we have the restoration demonstration here, but we don't get that here. And then we have the audio interviews with Gideon Bachman here, but we get those in another disc. So for the most part, everything that we got in the earlier Blu-ray release, we're getting here, with a few exceptions, as I indicated. But with those exceptions, I think we can still see that to have this film AMARCORD as part of the set is amazing. It is great to see it in this presentation of this masterpiece in the late period of Fellini's career. It's really interesting also to think of this film being a later period film, but it's also looking back on an early part of Fellini's life in that oh so magical, nostalgic way that still is not afraid to examine a little bit of the darkness, a little bit of the ambiguity and ambivalence, and also a little bit of the mystery that always exists when thinking about the historical past. But also there is a sense of the warmth and the charm and the dignity that is also present in the world of Fellini as expressed in AMARCORD. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.